This is episode 494 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Wally, the vetoing deadline and approval deadline, so signing of bills and vetoes, that ended on Good Friday, last Friday, and it was a interesting process to watch to see what happened with some of the bills that we were looking at during the 60-day session, most notably. And I think, Wally, I've been at this 17 years, and Rio Grande Foundation's been pretty darn involved in a lot of those legislative sessions for quite a while. The tax bill that she vetoed large swaths of was probably the most debated, discussed, and controversial, altered single bill in the 17 years I've been dealing with the New Mexico legislature. So just from a broad perspective, that was quite a ride with that tax omnibus bill.
Yeah, I don't know what the metaphor for that bill is. Is it the over-kneaded pie crust? Is it a soup sandwich? But it was a lot of interesting.
Soup sandwich.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, what is that thing?
Okay.
And and we'll talk a lot more about the details, Paul. But I think I'm glad I wasn't in the pool about what she going to veto, what she not going to veto, because my NCAA bracket was a lot higher winning percentage than what I would have guessed in terms of not only the tax bill but other bills overall. And we will see. But I was surprised at what she vetoed, and not as surprised about one thing she didn't veto.
Yeah, well, I guess we should kind of take advantage of that opportunity to provide a little bit of detail as to exactly what happened. I have no interest in going into something like the 37 or so provisions that were included in the bill as passed by the House and Senate. That bill, though, I will say we gave a 0 rating on the Freedom Index, which means in the case of the Freedom Index, it's neither good nor bad. It was just eh. And I think, in summary, the vetoes and the process that led to what we have now is as well. But
do you think a tiny bit better than it was, as how I handicapped it, but I didn't maybe go through each one in as much detail?
I think a lot depends on what happens in the future, because now, even more so than before, they have a boatload of cash that's just kind of sitting there waiting. So, of course, $3.6 billion surplus going into this session. It's noteworthy that about $1.2 billion of that was used for new spending. So right there, a third new spending. And that amounted to a general fund budget that's going to be $9.6 billion. That's a healthy increase, yet again, over previous years' healthy increases. So a third of the $3.6 billion surplus spent, and that's a big chunk of that money. The idea was that, and I don't know if they came up with this in Santa Fe or just kind of, this is by accident, but about a third of the money was allocated for this tax bill. Now, it is worth noting that just because it's in the tax bill doesn't mean it's a tax cut.
Right.
And that is very relevant for where things went, because 4 provisions ultimately were passed out of, like I said, dozens. First and foremost, film subsidies. I'm going to read off the so-called cost, and don't Art Laffer, don't yell at me, because I understand that there are things that cost money and that there are things that actually don't cost money because they return money to the taxpayer. But film subsidies were in the final bill. That's $87 million right there. And I'm using 2027 because I'm using the most significant, the highest single year cost, because sometimes things take time to be implemented, or you don't really know how much they're going to quote unquote cost until a few years out. So $87 million that was approved, film subsidy increase. This is included in the so-called cost of the overall bill, but it's not a tax reduction, it's new spending. Now, the only approved tax reduction that's recurring is the health provider deductible and copay reduction. That's $38.5 million. So that's the expected price tag for how much they're spending in or not collecting due to that tax. So less than half of the cost of the film subsidies. And this is worth acknowledging that this isn't just returning money to people. It does, fit into the overall let's do good policy here. We've been talking about this one for years, and the health practitioner health shortage is something that we all want to address. Child tax credit. Now, this is Voices for Children's big thing in the legislation. Cost $111 million. Now, it is a very progressive child tax credit, and it's also so-called refundable, which means that a lot of spending is going to result from this. We didn't see it in analyses of exactly how much of that $111 million cost was going to be in the form of actual tax cuts versus spending, but based on the way that things shakes out, it looks like about $100 million of it's going to be spending and $11 million is a tax cut.
Yeah, and the fact that once you say it's a progressive tax, that means that people are likely not paying little, if any, state income tax to begin with. So it's just here's money back. We're not cutting your tax bill.
Yeah, if you're wealthy and you have children, you're not going to get very much at all from the child tax credit. If you're not taxpayer at all to the state of New Mexico and you have children, you're going to get the full amount back. And that is not just in the form of taxes paid, that's in the form of spending. The biggest line item in the approved items, the 4 approved items, is the one-time rebates. Of course, $500 and $500 and $1,000. Tax rebates that are going to everybody. The total cost of that is $667 million. We've talked ad nauseum, Wally, about the pluses and minuses of the rebates. The only thing I think particularly interesting about that is the fact that during the campaign for governor, Lujan Grisham ripped into Ron Ketty, her opponent, for proposing rebates, and she had all these negative things to say about them. Some of them, are right. Rebates have conflicting benefits and drawbacks, but the 18.5% of the surplus will be spent or returned in the form of rebates. So that's a little more than half of what was spent in the form of just pure spending increases. Of course, that's a one-time deal, and that fit in with the governor's alleged stated concern about long-term issues in the revenue picture. $50 million, we estimate, or 1.4% of the overall surplus comes in the form of recurring tax cuts when all is said and done.
So what does that round to? Zero, zip, nada. So if you're doing a chart, it wouldn't even show. So
yeah, it would be very, very small amounts.
No, and not to say that $50 million is real money in a small state. You got to account for it. But yes, they are not using these one-time revenues to try to restructure anything for ongoing lower tax rates or taxation. That is for sure.
Yeah, and it does seem, for whatever reason, that there was an op-ed piece that ran on Thursday, so the day before the signing veto deadline, by former Senator John Arthur Smith, chair of the Senate Finance Committee, John Bingaman, Jeff's son, of course, former U.S. Senator. He's also on the State Investment Council and in the investment world. So these two wrote a column, and they seem to have, if not directly, they indirectly influenced the governor's thinking. The title was Huge Tax Package Puts Too Much of New Mexico on the Chopping Block. Governor Should Veto It. They mostly base their opinion article on the experience of Kansas, which is very dubious because Kansas was not in a long term. And, we've been in this oil-fueled budget boom for pretty much all of the Lujan Grisham administration. Right. So it's not a unique thing. This is a longer-term proposition. Kansas did spend a lot of money, although they probably didn't spend quite as much as we're spending in New Mexico or increasing spending. But they draw their comparisons and basically say we shouldn't do all this tax cutting. They don't seem to have any focus on the spending that went on and has gone on. And that brings me to Trevor, the treasurer of New Mexico, the cartoonist for the Albuquerque Journal. On Sunday, two-framed picture there. Recurring spending increases, and he shows the governor just, she's working that pencil till it pops. All the raises, the spending increases, pre-K, film subsidies, free lunches, etc., and really going to town. And then when it comes to recurring tax relief, let's think about this. We need to be prudent. And that's exactly right. But, to be fair to the governor, she's not the only one with I think, skewed mentality when it comes to the tax package or the issue of tax cuts. To fit the film subsidies into the bill, they weren't originally included. Christine Chandler, Representative Chandler said, we needed to delay the implementation of the gross receipts tax reductions in order to make way for film subsidies. And, again, that's directly deciding that recurring spending in the form of a new expansion of the film subsidy program is what we need to prioritize, not returning money, not cutting taxes, not making New Mexico's business climate better. So, anyway, Wally, we're going to go back and forth on this thing quite a bit, but wanted to give you a chance to weigh in here.
Yeah, well, the one thing, Paul, is that the film subsidies are the baby seals of state tax policy. They get kid glove treatment no matter what, and above and beyond everything else. And so it is very interesting. And then the other thing that, just as you talked about that, and I thought about this before you mentioned it, but it is interesting how they're like, well, we need to be really careful about reducing taxes because we might have to reduce spending in the future. It's never we need to have a proper tax structure so that maybe the economy can grow without, the economy can grow because of this tax policy. Oh, yeah, and we would have more revenue. Yeah, it's one of those things, government has a hard time cutting spending. New Mexico's government actually can cut spending relatively easily because they can't hire people for many of the jobs that they want to do. So they put the money in there, but they little things like 0.25% gross receipts tax reduction just panics them. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, it's one of those things. Don't think that doesn't go unnoticed by members of the business community who are already here and those who might seek to be coming to New Mexico, because we're getting up there into the amount of money that, how long will the oil and gas revenue last? Probably for a while. But if it doesn't, New Mexico is going to find itself in the, the horrible situation of having huge recurring spending without revenue and without a diversified economy. And that's the thing that really didn't get any quote unquote spending, investment, whatever you want to call it. and that is diversifying our economic situation here in New Mexico by doing anything that would do it. Now,
And
oil's in the ground, and it's in the ground where it's
Right.
going to be, and we'll keep doing that. But everything else, I think, went by the wayside, with the exception of film.
And that's exactly right. And that kind of leads me to my next point, which is that all of this just highlights the fundamental misguided understanding of tax and economic policy that we have among seemingly all the policymakers on the center left. John Arthur Smith being often described when he was in office as a conservative Democrat. I always took issue with that because I saw John Arthur Smith as standing for the permanent fund, but if you judged his record by the amount of spending that increased and the policies that were enacted, he never did anything to move New Mexico into a more economically free market, rational tax structure. He never spoke out about film subsidies and the problems that they bring about, and the wasted revenue. Never talked about he did sponsor a bill, but he never made it a priority, as I saw it, to really reform the gross receipts tax. And John Arthur Smith is a very likable man in the same way that your grandpa or my grandpa would be likable. He certainly understood a lot about tax policy, but he didn't fundamentally. And nobody who has controlled New Mexico, dare I say, since the days of Bill Richardson, actually has even a rudimentary understanding of economic development. And I said this to somebody recently, but I'll say it again. Bill Richardson genuinely, I think, wanted to move New Mexico's economy forward in a way that modern Democrats do not want to do. He often used government as a tool, like Eclipse Aviation and other things, but he actually tried to do a lot of those things where the current Democratic Party just doesn't even get it that much. And Bill Richardson obviously enacted major tax reduction in New Mexico, successful tax reduction in New Mexico, stuff that, if John Arthur Smith didn't like the crappy tax reductions in this bill with the amount of money we had available, John Arthur Smith must have been having nightmares for years on end about what Bill Richardson did, because those were some of the biggest tax reductions that we've seen in this state and saw in many states during that entire decade of the early 2000s.
Yeah, and then Richardson's tax cut is still held up as by many in the Democratic Party on the left as one of the worst things that's ever happened. Like, our state barely survived those income tax cuts that Richardson put through. When we know the case is hey, the economy was really slow, and income tax is not where a big chunk of the state's revenue comes from. It comes from oil and gas. It comes from gross receipts taxes, way outpaces income tax. But they still hold that out as, we need to learn from the past because Richardson cut taxes and then everything didn't go perfectly forever thereafter, which, believe me, a lot of things haven't gone well for the state of New Mexico since that time period, irrespective of tax policy.
Yeah, and it is worth kind of noting that, along with the bad, there was plenty of good. I'm not here to unduly praise Michelle Lujan Grisham. However, she did veto numerous tax increases and subsidies in that bill. Obviously, the film subsidy, it's there like the Terminator, Arnold Schwarzenegger. They just walk through a hail of bullets and they keep going. Don't mean to make any Alec Baldwin jokes there, but that's the film industry in New Mexico is like the Terminator when it comes to sucking up money and just keeps going no matter what you throw at it. But shockingly, especially given some of the other priorities pushed by the governor this session, She vetoed things like EV tax credits and storage credits and geothermal tax reductions and all kinds of, I think it was a credit actually, but uh, drawing the ire of left-wing, environmental groups, Sierra Club, and conservation voters. Martin Heinrich, who we all believe will be not dipping, but jumping fully into the pool of New Mexico politics when this governor is done in office. Heinrich kind of critiqued her vetoes of some of the environmental stuff that he wanted to see. And then, the alcohol industry, the anti-alcohol industry, people who wanted to see taxes raised. New Mexico In Depth, one of these left-wing so-called journalist nonprofits, they and a number of other entities were shocked and stunned that the governor nixed the alcohol tax increase, and they seem to believe that just raising taxes will solve all New Mexico's problems with alcohol abuse and alcoholism, which is definitely not correct. But so truly a mixed bag here when it comes to the governor and her approach to these vetoes. I will also make the point that it's like taking a bigger sandwich full of unappetizing things and shrinking it into a smaller sandwich made of the same unappetizing things.
Cutting the crust off of the side, maybe.
And I think that really just hammers home the point that, granted, Democrats have had control over this state for 90 plus years. They have set the table for where New Mexico is. Their actions have, put us into the positions that we are. And they might be forgiven, I suppose, for coming into a 60-day session in which, yet again, they have the governor and both houses under their control. So they don't feel the need to have a coherent agenda moving forward. The governor didn't even put out an agenda during the campaign for governor. So when push comes to shove, if you don't stand for anything, then you get all of these various bills flying around and concepts added to a tax package, and the governor decides, no, that's not what I want to do, vetoes it. That's kind of to be expected. But I'll just say this. The flip side has to be the Republicans, because they're always the minority in this state. They're always behind the eight ball. Conservatives, Republicans need to have a coherent and clear agenda to sell to voters. Say, this is what we believe in. This is what you're going to get if you elect us. Certainly, if you're in the majority, the House, Senate, and governor, we can pledge that we're going to do these things. But, like the medical malpractice issue, and we can deviate, get out of the tax policy swamp that we're in, and say, on that one, the Republicans made it very clear before the session that they were wanting to address that issue
by putting forth legislation that addressed it.
And those bills got knocked down. Unlike the Terminator, they were terminated repeatedly during the session. And then finally, I think a combination of the governor not wanting to be the last one to turn out the lights for all the doctors in New Mexico leaving, and all the public pressure combined to convince the Democrats with the week left in the session, maybe we should actually do something on this issue. So, it's something that is a critical need for those who believe that New Mexico not only is going down the wrong path, but has been going down the wrong path for many, many years. And I think while Republicans do have a little bit more ideological consistency and unity, they are the minority party, and they need to do better than they have.
They do, because I really did think that the Democrats were going to hang together, that their core constituency was the radical far left environmental groups, that they were going to do all those things that they said they were going to do. Well, they didn't do any of them. I think largely good. You know, the governor proposed a gross receipts tax increase and then vetoed it when it came to her. So it's not really
Increase, or you mean reduction?
yeah, reduction. She
Okay.
meant to reduce. Yeah, she was reduce the rate, and that was one of the few things early on that she said that gave any kind of lip service to, even, and then to veto that. So yeah, it does seem like our as a state, we're just kind of making it up as we go along, whatever feels good in the moment, And so I do think there's a big void there for legislation in a lot of areas that really impact people on a daily basis. I don't think we've seen the end of the doctor shortage. If anything, I think that was the bare minimum to keep it from being an immediate disaster. But I think the trend is still well established. And by the way, a lot of people who were considering coming here in the last 3-6 months saw that at the legislature, and they're like, yeah, maybe they're not as committed as I like. Maybe I won't be coming to New Mexico. And a lot of our doctors are getting older, retiring, and going to other places. Still big problems with education, not really very little, if any, policy work done on that. And then our economy, we wring our hands that oil and gas provides too much money and we need to diversify, but it's like hard to really point to the policy that would make that better. And, there's a lot of them. Reducing income tax might help. Restructuring gross receipts tax might help, but, not much happens. And so we did work a lot on social issues that are important to the very far left, but that are not necessarily everyday issues for people. But nothing, a lot of those things in the middle, from center left to center right, were just completely ignored by this session, and the far left got vetoed. So I'm confused, Paul. Let me just say, I don't know what is the plan in New Mexico. It's tough to tell from what happened in this session, and even harder to tell after the vetoes.
Yeah, hard to argue with anything you said. It seems like, I guess we can take it to the bank that the film industry is truly the juggernaut of special interest groups. I've always said that University of New Mexico is the number one most powerful special interest, and that may still be the case, but the Hollywood film industry seems to be very much right up there at the top. And, while Bill Richardson, we talk about him in a lot of ways as being the reasonable, rational Democrat relative to the modern group, he's the one that bequeathed to us this current structure for the film industry. To be completely fair, though, Gary Johnson got the ball rolling. So there's enough blame for that one to go around. And while Susana Martinez was probably the best in terms of actually restricting and placing caps on it and trying to reduce the amount of money flying out the door to Hollywood, unfortunately, she was dealing with hostile legislative forces. I did, because I could tell, and I think I predicted on this podcast, this show, and in a few other forums, that I did not think the governor would sign the bill as it existed. I thought there would be some changes. I did offer in the days leading up to Friday a few, what I was hoping for as far as helpful thoughts on what she should do. Now, this is within the restrictions of bills that kind of were discussed this session, and the financial scope. If I was in charge, I would do things even more differently. You can bet that more than 1/3 of that $3.6 billion, for example, would be used for tax reduction.
Right.
I'm a firm believer, and I'll say it until the cows come home and then they go back out again. Putting money aside for the future is not what we need to do for New Mexico government. It's better than spending it all, but it's just deferred spending, and we already have plenty of spending. We need to diversify the economy so that when oil prices do drop, that we're not screwed, for lack of a better word, because we don't have money at all in our budget. We need to be a diversified state. So I would have allocated nearly all of that additional money to tax reduction. So I would have had a much bigger package. But here's what I said she should do. She should veto the bill itself while adhering to the $1.1 billion figure it originally laid out by the legislature as to what they were willing to forego in the form of tax reductions. I said, call them back and get all the legislators on the agenda for a 0.5-cent reduction immediately in the gross receipts tax and address the pyramiding issue. Do that and call it a day. So that would have been kind of because the governor would control a special session, and she would have the ability to say up or down, do this or don't do this. There is no in between. And obviously that was a long shot whether the governor would ever go for that kind of policy, but that would have been maximizing the pro-growth reality as kind of the legislature had been dealing with it this year.
Yeah, and Paul, at least I do, and I think we tend, but I tend to focus on the gross receipts tax reduction from a business point of view. But keep in mind, it's so pervasive, and that's talk about your regressive taxes. That's the one right there. So getting rid of a lot of those things at a small business point of view could have really done a lot for the state. Should she have done it? Yeah, I didn't have any indication that she would, and man, she didn't even do the quarter of a percent reduction that she thought was a good idea without even dealing with pyramiding. So pretty underwhelming there.
Yeah, and one of the other issues that definitely needs to be addressed in Santa Fe is the capital outlay process. I was able to talk to Built Environment, which is a news magazine that focuses on state capitals, and they interviewed me about the myriad flaws in our capital outlay process. Normally, capital outlay bills, they call them the Christmas tree bills, and everybody loves Christmas trees. This is one of those rare bipartisan points of agreement because you don't want to be too vocal in your opposition and concerns with regard to the capital outlay, because a lot of local communities rely on that money, and especially the more rural, also read conservative parts of the state tend to really value those capital outlay dollars in a way that, bigger cities, Albuquerque, whatnot, don't necessarily rely on that capital outlay process and that legislation. But this particular capital outlay bill was a little more controversial because of the $10 million allocated for an abortion clinic on the border of Texas, explicitly to bring Texans to New Mexico to have abortions at a largely taxpayer underwritten facility, at least in terms of the construction. Presumably the operations won't be taxpayer financed, but who knows? It could be. So anyway, it is worth noting that was done this session, and again, it really highlights that politicians, policymakers, this governor, it's not even about supporting women's rights to abortion, this kind of thing. Whatever your philosophy on that, I think a lot of people who are more government should stay out of it and let women decide. If that's your position, you should generally oppose the use of taxpayer dollars to fund abortions, whether it's a facility, $10 million to be set up on the border, or through other government programs, including Medicaid. Now, very few people take that kind of principled approach to abortion. It's much more common that people have strong objections or strongly support, and this is a reality that is expressed in legislation in the capital outlay bill, and the fact that New Mexico taxpayers are paying $10 million. But it just shows you the rampant amount of money that is abjectly wasted and not even focused on the hopes and needs of New Mexicans. It is money that is for the politicians, by the politicians, and for the benefit of their reelections.
Yeah, and then when you get to the point where you can't be reelected, a lot of these things are positioning for your next job, not, so your constituency don't necessarily become the electorate of your current office. They become the potential future electorate or whatever it is you're angling for your next job. And so, yeah, that thought did occur to me that some of these things I'm not sure what the governor's plans are. It seems like we're shaping up for the attempted Martin Heinrich for governor and Michelle Lujan Grisham for Senate swap here in a few years. But yeah, I don't know what's going on. But yeah, a waste of money, no question about it. And, it's one of those things. Texas is very restrictive on abortion. We're we are not, to put it mildly. And so does the state need to put money in to build that clinic in Las Cruces, or could the private sector have, invested that money? And then finally, just our capital outlay process is thousands of partially funded projects that just languish. Maybe 10 million will get something done, but that whole product, and you call it the Christmas tree. I'm more of the pork descriptive. So that's just that's the pork. That's what we spread it, or that's how we spread the wealth around. Keep getting elected, but our capital outlay, we have a lot of money. As you say, a lot of times putting money aside is just deferred spending. Our capital outlay program is taking the money out of the economy and then not even spending it, just having it languish. So we have a lot of flow problems here in New Mexico, and that is definitely one of them. So,
yeah, and should note quickly that Yvette Harrell, the former congresswoman from District 2, Southern New Mexico, was narrowly defeated by Gabe Vasquez in the last election. She has announced that she will run in 2024. I've always been a big fan of Yvette. She previously occupied the seat that this week's interview guest, John Block, held down there. Basically the same general seat. But I think the upshot is, we're going to have another Donnybrook. It's obviously a very closely contested district. Yvette Harrell has been in that seat before and has the name ID. So we're going to have a lot of ads, maybe not quite running yet, but get ready.
Get ready.
And, quite frankly, maybe some Republicans, and I understand the thought is that you want to see new blood. Well, there's only so much blood to go around, so to speak, in terms of people who have the stature and the capability to run and succeed in a congressional race anywhere in New Mexico. So if you don't like Yvette Harrell, which I love Yvette, I think she's great and great on the issues. But if you don't, feel free to run against her in a primary. I don't think that's a problem. You should feel free to run. It's a tough job to get elected, and running in a primary is going to be a tough job as well for you. But we need more good candidates here in New Mexico, and I think Yvette's going to continue to fight for that seat, at least for the foreseeable future. So we shall see. But that's where we're going to leave it. Obviously, a lot of action around that tax bill with some pretty significant implications for the future. last thing I'll say is that the governor telegraphed that there would be no special session by saying that the assault weapons ban legislation was something she was focused on for the 30-day session. When you're already telegraphing for a 30-day session, it strongly implies that you're not looking at a special session. Not that there's been much discussion of that, but I strongly believe that there will be no special session unless something really crazy happens. So with that, we kind of hopefully get to say goodbye to the legislature for a little while and talk about other more interesting issues. So thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointsnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or have your Google Home play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.